Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone.
Good. Hello. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Ambrose Conroy, founder of Seraph. I'm joined today by Justin Fortier and Harrison Catlin. We're going to talk a bit about what's going on within the Trump administration, what executive orders mean, and what's being done that's going to impact industry and manufacturing moving forward. We're only taking a few minutes here to have this discussion, so many of you out there are going to have questions, and you're going to want to learn how it impacts you. We're happy to have one-on-one discussions. Please reach out to schedule a time when you can talk about your specific situation. Tariffs are one of these things that are very personal. Every part has a very different tariff number, and when we look at the tariff codes for each and every component and part, it's going to be important to understand how those impact you specifically. As more information comes out, we'll learn more. So let's jump into the presentation. The Trump administration this time around, Trump 47 administration, has a very different focus. There's just clear strategy. They're driving very aggressively to meet objectives that they set. This is much different than it was last time around. We're seeing offices being filled very quickly, appointments being made and approved and pushed through the Senate. So we're filling the administration with a purpose and aligning to a strategy that we hadn't seen before. And the Trump administration has been very, very busy. Harrison is going to talk a little bit about how we've seen executive orders from the Biden administration pulled back and how Trump is very quickly penning new executive orders to change a lot of what's going on at this point in time. But this is a very, very busy administration, as you can see by the chart here. In the first Trump administration, it was much closer to the Obama administration, but even slower in getting executive orders in place. Now he's leading the pack for the last few administrations, and he is very, very active. One of the most active presidents issuing executive orders that we've seen.
Yeah, so on the first thing that I think everyone was aware of, Trump came in and rescinded a pretty large slew of Biden executive orders, and that kind of fell into three categories. So first, he went after infrastructure funding by revoking executive orders that set up distribution networks for the IAJA and the IRA. And then the news that came out this morning is that the Office of Management and Budget put a temporary hold on all disbursements of federal funds. So this strategy looks to be a way to kind of delay any distribution of funding that hasn't been allocated yet from these bills, while giving Congress the chance to strike this funding out during the next budget reconciliation talks. Then on environmental policy, he's really gone after anything that sets national climate agendas that then trickle down to all domestic firms. What we expect to see here is that some states, including California, and really mainly California, will try to push back with their own climate agendas, and that'll probably set up a battle both in courtrooms and then over federal funding. We've already seen kind of Newsom and Trump go back and forth, with Trump indicating that he might withhold federal funds if California doesn't fall in line with his policy agenda. And then finally, on workplace and DEI, he's really removed any Biden policies that's aimed to push affirmative action in either government hiring or in any contracting and procurement procedures. So that won't affect many manufacturing leaders, but if you're bidding on government contracts and stuff like that, expect to see a removal of any DEI requirements that may have been in place during the Biden administration.
And we'd expect the enforcement of any previous policies that were in place or previous requirements to be abandoned at this point in time.
Yeah, of course. And then beyond just rescinding a lot of Biden executive orders, Trump has also started to lay out his own agenda. On environmental policy, the big one that we saw was declaring a national energy emergency and then putting out a couple executive orders that kind of advanced his agenda to remove any cumbersome permitting processes. And that'll grab headlines, but it's going to be hard to see how that'll impact energy prices in the short term, with a lot of geopolitical events more likely to impact energy prices. But the more impactful thing is his directive toward the EPA to reconsider its endangerment finding. And we don't know what they'll do there, but if Lee Zeldin, his pick to head the EPA, manages to get them to reconsider that, that will really kneecap the EPA's ability to regulate any emissions in the US.
And you have to remember that Trump made his money as a real estate developer, and real estate developers are constantly dealing with regulation, environmental regulation, testing, this and that. You can get a project hung up for years in an EPA or a local or state process. There's so much involved in it, and his his frustration with government stems from a lot of these regulations that he doesn't think do a whole lot. So we expect to see him use whatever powers he can to simplify things within the government. And he's been very clear that he's going to do that. So regulations will go away. Environmental policy will be the thing that has struck most. When he was out in California talking to Governor Newsom, he was very clear that he thought water should be diverted from Northern California down to Southern California. There are a lot of challenges in doing that, but his focus is, as a lot of people out here, I live in California, some of you know that, some of you don't, but a lot of people out here talk about the Delta smelt. And there's more effort put into saving the Delta smelt than there is to helping people. So a lot of money is spent on environmental policies and programs in California. It's a big focus, as everyone would expect. And Trump is trying to pull things away from that and try to reprioritize things. And he's very likely going to use leverage of the massive amount of federal aid that California is expecting in the wake of the wildfires to drive change. Playing on tragedy to drive change is a challenging situation, but I think it gives him a little bit of power, and Trump seems to like power and the ability to control and influence.
Yeah, definitely. And then on workplace and DEI, we spoke a bit about how rescinding a lot of Biden executive orders will impact federal hiring and then the federal procurement process. But what he's done with his own executive orders is kind of expand this philosophy to the private sector. So the big thing that I think a lot of people have heard about is he rescinded a LBJ executive order that established affirmative action. And with that executive order gone and a lot of the other Biden era policies gone as well, that really doesn't give any employer the grounds to give preferential treatment to any sort of underrepresented group. So what we expect to see is any non-complying employers, whether that's schools, public schools, or private employers, to be sued and really targeted pretty heavily by this administration, with the ultimate goal that they're going to try to get the Supreme Court to hear a case over their disparate impact doctrine, which would be kind of the last pillar of DEI standing right now in the US.
And Harrison, this is really interesting because what we've talked a lot about is HR had become very much about cost management and risk management. Controlling risks and controlling costs are a key theme rather than developing people. This change is going to be really impactful because anyone can sue because they feel they were discriminated against. Now, if you promote someone, if you promote a white male, someone will sue. If you promote a woman, someone will sue. It's going to really open the door up for a massive amount of litigation. And labor lawsuits, as we all know, are very painful. Insurance companies like to settle them rather than fight them. So we expect to see this become a much more challenging arena with the reduced legislation. And Trump very clearly yesterday was articulating all of his things. The key point he made here was he wants to develop a meritocracy within the United States throughout government and throughout private industry. So he's trying to set things up so that it can be merit-based promotions, merit-based raises, merit-based hiring.
Yeah,
We'll see
and
what
we've already
happens.
seen some reaction from especially the tech industry kind of scaling back their DEI branches within their companies. And then on the last category, obviously Trump's big one, tariffs and trade, he kind of surprised a lot of people by not coming out of the gate with heavy blanket tariffs across the board. He's indicated that on February 1st, there will be a 25% tariff on both Mexico and Canada. And then he's issued directives to a lot of department heads to get back to him in April with detailed reports on the state of trade globally and what they can do to reduce deficits and really address any concerns that Trump has. So really, the takeaway here is not to overreact to the current climate. Right now, tariffs just on Mexico and Canada would create some weird incentives that might further promote offshoring, but we don't expect this to remain in the long run. There's really no instance where Trump would keep these weird initiatives or this weird policy imbalance going. So he'd either roll out a broad blanket tariffs globally across the board and to promote nearshoring, or he wouldn't do it at all and they'd be used more as bargaining chips to get other policy initiatives passed.
And Harrison, I don't believe he's going to use these as bargaining chips. I think there's clear indication, as he references President McKinley, that he wants to have tariffs. He believes that tariff is one of the most beautiful words in the English language. He said that many, many times. He is going to put them in place. And what we're going to see is we'll see some tariffs used right now as tools to drive policy. The Colombia issue that we'll talk about in a minute is very clear and very telling for how he's using tariffs as a tool. But with Canada and Mexico, he's going to likely put tariffs in place. I expect to see them in February. And then we're going to see in April, at April 1st and April 31st, we're going to see the beginning and end of April, we'll see these reports come through from Congress. And I think based on that and based on preliminary data out of those, we're going to see a lot more of his strategy take shape and enable a much more formed and coherent policy on tariffs to be rolled out. So we won't see, well, can I move to Vietnam and avoid tariffs? Can I move to Costa Rica and avoid tariffs? I think it will be holistic, and it will be everyone is paying tariffs. And he was very clear at Davos, and we'll talk about that at the end. But he wants to have tariffs across the board. He wants to disincentivize people from shipping into the United States. He wants to incentivize people for manufacturing into the US.
Yeah, definitely.
So if we look at trade imbalance, because trade imbalance here is really interesting to me, and we've got countries like the United Kingdom, and in the United Kingdom they've got a $9 billion trade surplus. So there, and if you look at South America, you've got the same kind of thing going on. Trade surpluses, Trump wants to reward those countries. He's not so interested in tariffing their goods, but there will likely be some tariffs so that the trade balance doesn't shift. Others, like the EU, where we've got a significant trade imbalance, and if we break that down, it's countries like Ireland and countries like Germany that are there, and China. And one of the things I like to think about here, I'm going to use a specific example. So Novo Nordisk has a couple of products. They've got Ozempic and Wegovy. They're GLP-1s. Those products are sold for 10% of what the American consumer pays, or about 10% roughly, in China, in Australia, in the European Union, countries where there are cost controls on medication. We shouldn't, in the United States, in Trump's mind, be paying 10x this amount. So that's a massive amount of money. Novo Nordisk, the reason I'm singling them out is because their revenue drives so much of the GDP of Denmark. Why Denmark? Denmark controls Greenland. Trump has been very focused on Greenland. He's been focused on Greenland to look at the strategic minerals that are there, but also it's a big landmass where he can put up barriers to people coming over from Europe, for Russia, for China, for others coming to our East Coast. So he's looking at how he can strategically grow our mineral reserve, and he's also looking for where he can have a defense barrier. But when we have companies that are very focused on taking advantage and are making super profit in the United States compared to the rest of the world, that will be noticed by the Trump administration. And the whole healthcare economy here, I believe, is very ripe for reevaluation in the current administration. Automotive manufacturing, others where there's mass dollars, is definitely going to feel a lot of pressure. But there are some industries, and the healthcare economy is one, where we expect to see a lot of potential pain moving forward. So we'll watch this. We'll watch the trade imbalances as they start to shift and move. But he does not want to have deficits. He wants to make sure that we have much more of an equal playing field, and he intends to use tariffs to do this. So Trump's tariffs promise has been very clear. He has talked about wanting to put that 25% tariff in place on Canada and Mexico. We've talked about this before. He's talking about using national security measures to do that, which enables him to sideline USMCA. We expect those tariffs to hit in February. Now, there are two schools of thought within the administration. There's Bassett and the Treasury, who want these things to be rolled out more slowly, and you've got Navarro and others who want to hit hard and be very direct and drive a reaction and move things back into the United States. China, we're going to see more tariffs increase on China. Right now, there is a bit of how do we work with China? Is there a way to do this without really sparking a full-on trade war? It's not seeming like we'll get to that point, and that is going to have massive implications because China is the manufacturing heart of the world. So we're going to see what's happening there. A couple of things to note, though, about China. The demographics are changing. The population over 50 is greater than the population under 50, and the current birth rate is very low. So we're seeing a shift there, which is going to put a lot more pressure on China in the next decade or two, and we expect to see different things happen. along with these tariffs that Trump's talking about, he has offered some interesting tax rates. So carrot and stick, a 20% tax rate for any company in the United States, and a 15% tax rate on companies that manufacture here in the United States. We want to see what Congress does in terms of that legislation, but that would be incredibly impactful and be a real reason for companies to start to shift back into the United States to manufacture here, and for us to see a reindustrialization in the United States. So we're very focused on the United States and Trump's policies right now. These will impact people in Europe. These will impact people in Mexico, in South America, and Asia. The world will be impacted by all of these policies, which are developing very, very slowly, but are moving at a faster pace than most people would have expected. Colombia was a very interesting example here. In Colombia, we saw something happen that we didn't expect to see happen. The president agreed to take flights, military flights, repatriating his citizens. He then, in the middle of the night, decided, we're not going to do this, stop. Trump woke up the next morning, said, this is crazy. We're going to put a 25% tariff in place on everything out of Colombia, so your cup of coffee would have cost more in the morning. Then there was an agreement that we weren't going to do this. Now Colombia is sending jets to the United States, so we're not even paying for the repatriation flights. Their citizens are getting on their jets and they're being flown home. It's a win for both countries, but Trump gets the illegal immigrants that he wants out of the country. We're going to see how this plays out, but we expect this to play out a lot more moving forward.
Yeah, and one interesting piece with that as we carry forward and just think about the other points of Mexico and Canada that he's mentioned. Colombia was an example of case study, an example case study where he had a political issue that wasn't trade related. We already reviewed some trade surpluses, but now he's focused on can I solve some of my other challenges like border security with Mexico? Can I use tariffs to solve those? So it's not just about balance of trade for him. In this case, he was happy to resolve it without any sort of tariffs. So that's one thing to watch. And next up, we've got some data points we're looking at. Of course, we're listening to what Trump is saying, and we are reasoning here with listening to what he's saying and thinking about what is possible. But at the same time, we're also now able to look at two of the largest prediction markets, which are Kalshi and Polymarket. If you were following the US election, this was one of the first examples where they really outperformed any sort of pundit like us, or consultant and economist to get that right. So that's one reason why we're looking here. Now, there's not as much volume, so the volume here is still all below 1 million on any one of these markets, but this is a new behavior that lots of different people betting on what outcome they think is possible, and something I'd encourage you to look at. That's just Kalshi.com and Polymarket that you can find. But we've pulled up 4 markets here. One side on the left hand, where pretty good indication that people think tariffs are coming. If you look at that, will Trump impose tariffs on any country before March? That was a new market opened up in the last week on Kalshi, and almost $600,000 has been bet, and that's at 73%. So the bettors think it's possible that it's going to come somewhere. But then if we look at the right side, not as many people are confident about exactly the shape it will take. So we've got a chart about, will the weighted average of tariffs go from over 2% to 5%? Most people think unlikely in the first 6 months. So it's not going to be a full court press everywhere. That's what these bettors are thinking. So just a data point to consider. And Ambrose, I think you've already talked a bit about your forecast, but if you have anything else to add about how you're thinking about it.
I think the numbers here are small, so a couple of people can really influence this and can drive it down. So I think we won't really know until when you get over 1 million, you seem to get better data out of these markets, and that's $1 million that people have bet on the outcome of the market. So these numbers are low. I personally am seeing a lot of indications that we're going to see tariffs hit Mexico soon, and Canada soon. We've got 2 different schools of thought, and I've talked a little bit about this. You've got Bessett in the Treasury, who are very focused on, let's do a controlled implementation, and then you've got Navarro and the team, where they want their trade hawks, their tariff hawks. They want to see these tariffs in place very, very quickly. Navarro's team is very much wanting China to get hit, but I think a lot of the pressure that we're going to see put on Mexico and Canada deals with two different things. It deals with the illegal immigration problem. It deals with the drug problem, which also was impactful in the Colombia discussions. And it focuses on how do we move and reindustrialize the United States. Because there's schools in the Trump administration right now that believe we're back in the 1930s and early 1940s, where we need to rebuild our industrial base, rebuild our military industrial base, so that we're capable of sustaining the country and sustaining the West through a major conflict.
Yeah,
And if
maybe
that major
Harrison, you can
conflict,
go to the next slide and we can.
yeah, so McKinley was one of Trump's favorite things. He renamed Denali Mount McKinley, and he did that for a very specific reason. He liked what President McKinley did with tariffs. And if we look at the tariffs and where they came from and what was going on, President McKinley really drove a massive increase in tariff collection. And tariffs were a big funder for the United States really up until the end of World War I and World War II. So if we go to the next slide, what we're going to see is we're going to see that, on the left part of the slide, you're going to see all of this dark. The gold is really the income tax, individual and corporate. You don't see a lot of that until you get to the 1920s. So initially, the U.S. government was funded by land sales, and then it was funded by tariffs and excise taxes and liquor taxes. And then we get to a point after the wars where we need to start paying down debt. We need to start paying for other things. So we put some small income taxes in place. And after World War II, we decide that the United States is shifting from a mercantilism view of the world, where it's a limited things, one for one. There's always a winner and always a loser. To a globalization view of the world, where we think that everyone can win and everyone can get better. The school of thought seems to have shifted back in the United States to more of a mercantilism view of the world, that not everyone can get better in parallel, and that we are no longer the manufacturing heart of the world. So there's no longer a reason for us to avoid tariffs. We are importing more than we're making. The manufacturing base in the United States has been crushed to a point where we believe we have to reindustrialize. And I think that within this administration is going to be very meaningful and very impactful. And it's going to drive a lot of their industrial policies. So if you run a manufacturing company and you're buying a lot from outside of the United States, if you're an auto company and you're shipping parts from the United States to Mexico, back to the United States, back to Mexico in order to do work on them, that model won't work anymore. And we're going to have to look at how do we pivot very, very quickly and in a timeline that is not something that any of us are used to. If you're making things in Europe or you're making things in Asia and you're shipping them in the United States, my expectation is that by May, we're going to see a lot of changes and we'll see a strategy come out where we've equalized the tariff playing field. As Harrison was saying, you have to have equalization, otherwise you're going to move to different countries and try to find ways around it. But we expect, and Trump has been saying, that the taxes that are collected will become less of an impact here, and the tariffs will increase so that he can reduce taxes and really incentivize people to do things in the United States. There's a lot of speculation here, and there's a lot to learn. But the clearest statement that Trump made for me was at Davos, where he laid out his policy very, very clearly. And I think there was a lot of silence from the leaders that were in that room. I watched this and you heard the room sort of go silent. There was a little laughter at the beginning, and I think people were nervous and uncertain what he was going to say. But he was clear. If you want to manufacture goods in the United States and you want to do things here domestically, he's going to give you some of the lowest tax rates in the world. He wants people to come back here. He wants companies to come back to the United States. If you're doing it elsewhere, he's going to put in tariffs so that you can manufacture wherever you want. He's not telling you to manufacture just in the United States, but if you manufacture elsewhere, there will be tariffs. It was a very clear statement. And he also has made some statements about companies that are being taxed elsewhere. So I think this impacts countries like Ireland, where the tech companies have set up and that their European headquarters. They're paying a tremendous amount of taxes to Ireland. That really is feeding into their tax system. It's helping them to wipe out their national debt. It's allowing a lot of great programs to come into play. But there is a huge risk that Trump will reclaim those taxes and put more pressure on the European Union. I expect to see a lot of trade discussions and possibly trade conflicts arise in the next 12 months. And I believe that after April, we're going to see a lot more come in place. We're going to see a clear tariff strategy, but tariffs will come in before April. So there's a lot going on here. Again, we've just taken a short time here to talk about this. There's a lot going on. There are a lot of moving pieces. a lot of this has to be talked about specific to your company, specific to the products that you make. What I'd like to do is I'd like you to invite you to follow Seraph on LinkedIn. If you do that and you follow our Transforming Industry blog, you'll learn a lot more about what we're talking about. Please reach out to me. I would welcome a chance to have a discussion with you. If you have specific questions, let's have a one-on-one chat. Let's get your team together, our team together. Let's see how tariffs will impact you. On that note, we'd love to take some questions. So Justin, are there some questions out there?
Yeah, there's a few, although I'd like to see more if people have the time to ask them. There's one comment, more of a comment than a question, but today global trade as a percent of global GDP is much more than 100 years ago. That argument is not valid current days. And I think for me at least, and I'll say something, then maybe Ambrose can react. I think if we rewind back to this chart, I would definitely agree that trade has really changed over the last 100 years, and that it's a lot harder to unwind something than to start from a new position. But at one point, the United States definitely did import almost all of its manufactured goods, had very little manufacturing. So they had received things via trade, and they implemented a bunch of tariffs. But I agree, it's definitely not as simple as Trump makes it out to be. And I think most of
I'm
the
going to try
people on
to
this call are
I'm
going
going to try
to.
to I'm going
Yeah,
to
go
simplify
ahead.
it, Justin. I think that the Trump administration, there are a lot of people here who are war hawks. And we saw the first Trump administration start to put economic pressure on China and start to try to build some separation and drive some reasons for the US and the West to reindustrialize. Biden continued that. We're now seeing even more push from China. They've massively ramped up their drone construction. They've done a lot of things to really arm themselves in a way that would make it very easy for them to move on Taiwan or move elsewhere. They are testing military equipment every day against the West in Ukraine. So we're seeing what looks like a massive military buildup from China. Now, this is going to be unpopular with a lot of people, but this is what the administration is seeing. And the administration is talking about this quietly. If that is their view, they need to find a way to disconnect from the Chinese manufacturing engine and rebuild the manufacturing engine in the West. So if we look back to the 1930s and the 1940s, what Roosevelt did, the plans that were put in place, how we built up our manufacturing, how we drew connections at that point in time. It was Roosevelt and Henry Ford. Now it's Trump and Musk. We're seeing a lot of things changing. And as we build up at that point in time, the United States was in a place after World War II where we became the world's manufacturing engine. That's when we did away with tariffs. That's when we shifted things. I think we've fallen back. We're no longer the world's manufacturing engine, but we're still the world's largest consumer market, and people want to sell into the United States. So Trump is trying to leverage that. He's trying to rebalance the global playing field. In his mind, it needs to be rebalanced. And that is going to drive some changes that none of us in industry expect or like, but we're going to have to live with, and we're going to have a plan to deal with them because they're coming whether we want them or not.
Here's a good question from Ruben Lostal, Dr. Ruben Lostal. In your opinion, will the tariffs be applied to specific products or across all products, including those under the IMMEX program between Mexico and USA? So do we think it's going to be blanket or specific?
I think it's going to be blanket. I think the reason that the national security card has been played is because that gives Trump a blanket authority to put things in place. If you listened to the Baxter earnings call, they were very concerned. They make a lot in Mexico that they import to the U.S. There are a lot of medical device and medical product clusters down in Tijuana, in Juarez, and in other places that ship across the border. Normally, medical goods are excluded from these types of tariffs. But I think Trump is going to take a much more holistic view, and we're going to see across the board tariffs so that we're shocking everyone. So that goods that you would have moved from the US down to Mexico, back to the US, back to Mexico, and then ship the end product up to the US, as happens with some automotive products, we're going to see those get tariffs, and that will make that supply chain completely untenable.
And I'm scrolling through here. This is more of an interesting comment, but I've had a few conversations with leaders of large companies, and they're delaying plant moves based on coming tariffs, and others that they're saying that they can manage the tariff increases for this administration and hope for a change in the next election. Any
I think
reaction to that?
a lot of people are looking at this from a different perspective. We've got some clients that we've talked to recently who have operations in Mexico and Canada whose business would be completely unviable. They would they'd be left with a choice of either shut down or sell at a loss for the period of the tariffs. Um, we've got others who have enough margin where they could take the 25% tariff, or where they've got price elasticity to the point where they could pass that on to the customer. I think a lot depends on your specific situation, and this is why I'm encouraging people to reach out. Let's have a specific discussion about your situation to understand how these tariffs and how these trade policies may impact you.
So I think we've got one last one here, unless somebody else adds a question. But from Shogi, can you further explain why cost reduction through actually, maybe the second part of his question is easier for us to answer here. Which auto OEMs are at a structural disadvantage going forward in the timeline you folks gave?
My view, I think Stellantis is probably at the largest disadvantage. Their manufacturing footprint in Mexico is very telling, and they will pay a big price. But I think if we look across the board at the automotive OEMs, and we look at inventory days on hand, which we looked at in our last auto report, the OEMs have almost built a strike bank or a tariff bank, so that if this is a 3 to 6 month tariff, they could hold product in Mexico and not need to ship across until they got ready. This would have a massive disruptive effect on the industry, because if plants were idled in Mexico for 30, 60, 90, 120 days, and when we look at the supply on hand, then we'd see that burn down to close to zero, and we'd see constraints happen again, like happened after COVID. But the automotive OEMs, Stellantis in particular, could very easily idle plants, avoid paying the tariff, and take a wait and see approach to see if this is a short-term action or a long-term action. And then if it's a long-term action, they haven't really lost a whole lot. They haven't reduced their prices. They haven't had to up their incentives, and they've burned through the inventory that they've got on dealer lots and in yards right now in the United States. So I think we're going to have to wait and see. I think everyone that manufactures in Mexico or imports into the United States is at risk here. It's really only the plants that are manufacturing in the United States with a high proportion of U.S. goods. The least impacted would likely be Tesla, and with Musk and Tesla being very close, with Musk and Trump being very close, I think that bodes well for Tesla. But we have to see earnings reports are coming
Tesla
out, and
just
volumes
has
seem down.
the highest American concentration or U.S. concentration of parts and assembly. So that, even just beyond the personal relationship, that's really one of the core reasons why Tesla is well positioned there.
So we're out of time right now, Justin. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. Again, please reach out if you'd like to have a very specific discussion. We just covered the very top of this. We can go a lot deeper. We're continuing to research this, and we'll be tracking this through the administration, because I think the Trump policies will have a massive impact on industry and manufacturing. We're seeing the push to bring things back into the country. Please follow Seraph on LinkedIn if you want to hear more about this. Please subscribe to our Transforming Industry blog. The link is here. And then reach out if you want a copy of the slides that we have. We're happy to share them with people. They'll be on our website, and you can download them from there. Thanks very much. Have a